to do justice to this, it's obviously you can't do that in a short time, so I just thought I'd address some of the interesting points and talk more really about where we're moving theoretically in the field as well. I thought I'd start off with talking about something that we probably don't think about anymore, and that's bulletin boards. Then moved to this issue of, we were questioning whether real relationships happen online versus are they shallow and meaningless, and Joe and Katie's work over the years have demonstrated how important online relationships are, but more importantly, how it is that you should progress them in a healthy kind of manner as well. And then I thought I'd move to looking at just more one specific type of online relationships, and that's with online dating, and I guess that's relevant to what we've been doing in our research, and it's just easy to focus on one thing, I guess. And looking at the differences and similarities with online dating with other spaces online, because it's important not to look at one generic space online, and then coming to a conclusion of how might we look at online dating for the future, at least with online dating sites and some of the issues that have come up in some of my own research and others when it comes to online dating. So bulletin boards were a very early part of the internet, and even in those days, they kind of highlighted the importance of online relationships. People were getting on there, developing relationships, but also they were all getting on there and having kind of kinky, erotic kind of conversations as well. They were a very popular place for that. And people kind of question, oh my goodness, if people on there having these weird, kinky conversations, is it going to generate more kinky, weird people out there? What's going to happen? And on the positive side, others were saying, well, actually, it's a good way to people to meet up and explore things when it comes to issues of sexuality. And Katie did stuff on homosexuality quite a few years ago. The issue of, well, actually provides a safe space to explore sexuality in many ways as well. So in many ways, it's actually quite a healthy thing to engage in. There are researchers like Diane Wasocki who's got in there and done some very interesting research on bulletin boards and sexuality and documented exactly what actually goes on there if anyone wants to read some of her stuff, especially looking at the S&M sites. And one of the things that she found in more recent kind of work was interesting, that people didn't want to be anonymous anymore, that people wanted to show their face on these sites. And so this kind of, in the history of online dating, you saw in the video clip at first, this idea of it's just text, all it is text. And our theories that were developed were about this textual interaction and what do we do to overcompensate for that. There's no nonverbal cues, and the video kind of highlights that very nicely. You put on these emoticons and these other words that honestly when I was looking at that I couldn't translate most of that stuff myself. So researchers kind of got in there and very early on identified that real relationships happen online, even though theoretically they thought maybe they won't happen because you have this absence of social cues and you have this absence of social presence as well, so people might be nasty to each other. And instead we find people get quite intimate online. And so here are just some basic stats, just showing the descriptions of how many relationships would be formed online. So Parks and Floyd looked at news groups and they found loads of people were actually developing real relationships in these sites, and some even romantic relationships, and that was published in '96. Then they looked at moos and found again we're getting real relationships happening online. Sonia Utes looked at MUD, so looking at all these different spaces. She also found that real romantic relationships were happening in this space. In some qualitative work that I did quite some years ago, what we found, in addition to saying yes, real relationships happen online, that people were identifying they wanted to keep them online as well, that you could actually have a romantic relationship, works fine, keeps people happy, but they didn't want to move it beyond that space necessarily. Of course, lots of people do, but then it didn't necessarily make it unhealthy because it remained in that space at all. So that's looking a little bit of the early days. But what about the early days when it came to online dating? Well, when it came to online dating, in the very early days, it was mostly men on the sites anyway. So it took a while to encourage women to get onto the sites, and I think men were just sitting there hoping some women would come along. And a lot of the stuff was very textual still, and why that was is because of the technology, so what technology can do. But now we have much more advanced technology. The different sites are being created in different ways, and some are embracing some types of technology and some aren't. And I guess one of the interesting questions for online dating sites is which types of technology are going to work well. Like, for instance, video, the use of video, which shows people more and giving you more information about someone. Do people actually want to use that, or do they still want some kind of anonymity, for instance? So, looking at some of these sites, there are many, many different types of online dating sites. So we've got ones like Match.com, which generates a lot of participants, and what the people on these types of sites have to do is actually do the searching for themselves. They have to do a lot of the work themselves and find people on. They create their own profiles, they usually put their photographs up, describe themselves, and then look for other people within the site and contact them. eHarmony, as we know that supported the research, do a very different system where they actually do the matching themselves based on all sorts of scales. We have other ones that are more sexual kind of sites as well, so they're not just for romantic relationships. Some are hooking up for sexual encounters, some much more sexual encounters, some for looking at gay sites. Now, the gaydar site's quite interesting because it does both. It actually looks at romantic, looking for long-term romantic relationships as well as sexual encounters. Powership is another example, something a little bit like the eHarmony kind of formula. Then you've got ones that are actually specialising on a particular social identity. Now, I think those are quite interesting because although they don't actually bring many people to them, theoretically it kind of should work if you have more people there in some ways because of the idea that you feel like you know them a little bit more. So if you get on there and you're a Christian, you feel like you've got something in common with these individuals before you kind of start. And there's ones that are even goth sites. So there are many, many, many different types of online dating sites that exist out there. So how is online dating perhaps different to the way relationships develop in other spaces? And as other people have looked at it as well, the idea that every space online can be different. So online dating is not just different to face-to-face dating, but it's also different to the way people develop relationships in other spaces online. One theory that social psychologists use is an unfortunately named social penetration theory. And what that theory talks about is the idea that you kind of disclose things gradually by depth and breadth when you get to meet someone. So you tell them a little bit about yourself and you test the waters and you see, did they like that about you or did they not like that about you? So you might admit that you like a particular band, for instance, and that person is like, don't really like that group at all. So then you don't go into how you're so fanatical about them, whatever, if you still want to impress them. And in work that's been done looking at online relationships and discussion groups and news groups, you find that people can do that. They can gradually open that up and in some ways disclose some things about themselves that are quite intimate that they would never have done face-to-face so easily, perhaps. But when it comes to online dating, then you have a certain profile that you develop and you disclose all this information without being able to test the water, without being able to test for reciprocity, without being able to highlight this bit's the most important part. If you like that part too, then we can focus on that issue. That's not how it happens. So there is, what's quite different about that is there is very little opportunity to test for reciprocity. But also in some ways, and these guys have done a lot of research on the strategies that people use when it comes to romantic relationships. In some ways, you can be more strategic when it comes to online dating, but sometimes that's a downfall of online dating as well. So what's it similar to then? Well, it can be similar to personal ads like in newspapers, where again you give a bit of information about yourself, and you're declaring what you want in another person, who you are, what kind of qualities that you have, and then you meet up. So it's kind of, again, another little ad, but just not as much information as online dating. And video dating as well, where people create a video of themselves with an online, with a dating group, and they go and find clients for them that they might be able to match up to. So there are similarities out there. That's not exclusively the way, the only type of dating strategy that there is. What's also interesting, if you look at research that has been done on online dating and you look at research that's been done with personal ads and video dating, you find some interesting similarities. For instance, that our women will emphasize qualities about how thin they are, and perhaps they lie about that, like they lie about with online dating. Men might exaggerate about their height, for instance. Men will talk in their ads about what kind of status they have in terms of their occupation, their money earning. You get that also more declaring on online dating sites as well. So these kind of gender differences, when you have that scripted, it becomes so obvious in these particular scripts. Whether or not those scripts are effective or not is another thing as well. And when it comes to online dating, at least in the interviews that I've done, people get sometimes very skeptical of what people write. They become kind of really savvy online daters in a way, looking through it and thinking what's real and what's not real. So looking a little bit at what are some of the problems then with online dating, and what are perhaps some solutions, and really I don't have many solutions, but some ideas of what one could look at. One of the issues that, at least that's been coming up in my research, is this issue of strategies of self-presentation. That when people create a profile, they think long and hard about their profile, what to put in their profile. They consult friends sometimes to decide what to put in. And they think about, well, what person did I attract to that profile? Oh, that didn't attract the right person, then I'll rewrite and do something else. But the thing is, they do spend a long time kind of commodifying themselves in a way. And in that way, it causes some problems for them, it causes some disappointments for them as well. In terms of some of the strategies people use, that I've interviewed at least, they'll say that they do things that perhaps they think it kind of looks romantic, but others will say didn't really work for them. For instance, a cliched kind of profile. A lot of the respondents that I interviewed would say they hated profiles of individuals saying that they sipped red wine next to log fires and went for nice long strolls on the beach. And one woman I interviewed even says to me, if they're all strolling on the beach, how come I'm not running into them all? So there is a problem in saying this looks romantic. I'm a romantic, lovable person, surely you'll buy into this profile. But people that are using these sites go, no, nobody's really like that, so you can't put this kind of picture of yourself up there. And it kind of enters nicely with Katie's stuff when it comes to this idea of an actual or a real self, you know, what are they doing? Is it the true ideal self in there, and is that going to really work? Or do they have to actually present a self that they can live up to in that first meeting? And the thing is, if they don't live up in that first meeting, even in terms of personality, and it might take some people a bit while to warm up because they're a little bit shy or whatever, they don't do it, then that's it. They dismiss them as being a deceptive person. There are many other profiles there to choose from. Go to the next kind of lot. Other issues are deception, and I guess we hear this all the time in the media, and it is true, people do deceive others online. Some of the deception of people that I've talked to has been quite outrageous deception. I think I've told some of you before that there was one woman I interviewed, she really liked the photograph, quite a handsome chap, meets him and nothing like the photograph. He turned out to be quite large and quite bald and much older than what she thought he was meant to be. And she says to him, "You're nothing like your photograph." And the guy says, "Well, it's a picture of my brother, and I thought I looked quite like my brother." And she was very disappointed by that, obviously. And so some people will use very deceptive kind of photographs, but others will use photographs in the most flattering light, I guess. And even online daters are a little bit skeptical about that, because if it looks like it's a professional photograph, then they'll say, can they really live up to that photograph? I'm imagining they can't live up to that all the time. Other kind of deception, and I think this is stuff that also Jeff Hancock and others have done, is looked at whether or not people are being honest about their weight and their height. And so again, you find women are kind of saying they're a little bit slimmer than what they are, and men are a little bit taller. And one woman I interviewed, she says to me, I put myself as average when it comes to weight. In fact, she says, I really am overweight, but isn't overweight average anyway? So therefore it must be... and this information must be correct. But the other thing is, when it comes to deception, people will mark some things that are quite subtle things as being indications of deception. So they want to have someone that they can trust, and I guess they feel like even if it's slight exaggeration of their job or whatever, then they're likely to go, no, I don't trust that person. Whereas if you meet face to face, often people do exaggerate some aspects of themselves, and people are a little bit more forgiving there. So one of the things that people, in looking at the strategies of self and deception, there are some people out there now that actually get money in helping people develop profiles, helping them to develop something that's a little bit more realistic, also that stands out amongst the crowd still, so it looks attractive, it looks interesting. So this is perhaps one strategy. Another strategy could be that online dating sites could get into more in counselling or helping their clients actually write more effective type of profiles. And there are some online dating sites that are starting to do that as well. Because of this deception or the fear of deception, individuals get in there and they look for indicators of trust. And here's another solution that individuals are finding for themselves. So if they want to verify age, for instance, they'll look at the clothes that they're wearing. So does that look like the sort of clothes that an individual would wear? They look at the language that they use. If they claim to be a younger person and they're not using kind of more text speak, then they get suspicious of that. If they are saying that they're well educated and they're not spelling correctly, then they think, well, I don't trust that person either. So individuals are looking for indicators of trust. Another kind of interesting indicator of trust that has come out in the literature is the idea of self-disclosure. If the self-disclosure seems too fast, and some online data say, this seems a little bit too desperate and too rapid for me, I don't feel comfortable with this person either. So in terms of how do we deal with this indicator of trust, well, it might again be instructing clients how to do this better, but it also could be in terms of online dating sites that they could think of design issues on how to improve their sites to be able to develop that a little bit as well. Another thing that comes out in the research is this issue of the idea of having to work hard to try and find a partner yourself. So you pay for the service, but then you've got to go in there and you've got to do the work. You've got to design the profile. You've got to go and look for an appropriate person. So this has also been another problem. How do you deal with that problem? Well, some companies deal with it by doing the matching themselves. Another way of dealing with it might be thinking about these kind of smaller online dating sites like, you know, the Christian ones or whatever, in the sense of social identity, in terms of social categories, that perhaps online dating sites could think of more social categories that individuals could identify with that might help the matching process in some kind of way, or something that they feel like they could actually match. Another issue and I'm saying there's all these terrible issues, but there's lots of success with online dating as well. But another issue is that some people aren't very good at matching with other individuals. They're not very good at choosing an appropriate partner. In my own research, many of the people that I interviewed talked about this issue of people raising the hurdle a little bit higher than what they could actually attract. So they think, oh, they're so lovely, and surely I can get one of those people. And then they meet them and it's like, that person's not interested in them. They're like, oh, okay, I have to kind of look back and think about this. So in psychology, we have a theory called the matching hypothesis, that people of similar kind of looks or similar status are kind of attracted to each other. And because on these sites there's often so many people to choose from, it's like kids in a sweet shop thinking, oh, I could have all these kind of lovely sweets. But in the end, it's not really quite true. So finally, one other issue, and I think we talked about this earlier today, is this issue of stigmatization, that people using online dating sites are stigmatized. And it's an interesting question, why is it stigmatized? Is it stigmatized because it's a new activity? Well, I don't think that's the reason why. And why is that? Because there's things like speed dating, which is also a new activity, but it's a very social activity and it's really not given the same kind of stigmatization. Perhaps the stigmatization has to do with the process that you're clearly there looking for a date. When it comes to speed dating, the issue is also a social kind of event. And so when people are looking desperately, or looks like they're looking desperately for a date, then that can kind of become a more stigmatized activity. So one way to perhaps get around stigmatization is to make that activity not just seem like a dating activity, perhaps. But these are all ideas and suggestions. And I think I might finish there and bring Joe and Katie to talk.
Do you want to take should we see if there are a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure.
Arthur, could you, do we have a mic, or should we just speak up? Sorry? Okay.
I was just wondering, you talked about some deception that people do online. I was wondering if there were some forgivable deceptions and things that weren't forgivable, if you knew of anything like that.
I think it has to do with how long people have been using the sites as well. And this is just, I mean, it's not measurable, I haven't measured this at all, but from some of the interviews that I've done, that because they've experienced some terrible lies, then when they start getting lies that aren't so big, then they become perhaps a little bit more forgivable then. So it's perhaps more on an individual and an experience kind of way, because someone that's been using it for a short time and has a small lie, it is very unforgivable in that sense. But some people do go back and they reflect on it. And they also, from the interviews that I did, they also reflected on themselves and their own deception as well. And why did that person not like me? Or why wasn't it working? And then they go back to their profile and think, what was it in there? Perhaps it wasn't quite right, that, you know, I attracted someone that, you know, I couldn't live up to this. And some of them would actually give it to friends to say, how do you see me? Does this match up to how others see me rather than how I see myself, kind of thing, in the profile? Yeah.
I would like to know, what are the aims of your research and what outcome would you like to find eventually?
Oh, okay. My aims for the research, well, I guess I've done quite a lot of different studies, so different studies have got different aims. And when it comes to the online dating research that I've done, some of the aims were how do people present themselves on it, and what are the more successful strategies to present yourself on online dating sites, and that's more kind of qualitative kind of stuff. My research is not just focusing on online dating. I guess the latest thing that we've been doing with Alex back here is looking at online deception issues, or looking at deception across different modes of communication. So I guess would take me like quite a few hours to go through all the different aims and research questions, but we can chat about that afterwards if you like.
Can I summarize in one sentence? Is that your aim is to stimulate development of online dating, encourage people to go online more?
No, that's not my. I mean, I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but I don't have an agenda of whether they should or they shouldn't go online to find dates. Yeah.
One other question, yes.
This is actually more of a general question, and probably to you and also to the other speakers as well. But what are the things that are unique about internet dating that really stand out against? Because I'm thinking that the telephone and sort of letter writing and the postal system, when these things first came into development, everyone had these same questions, really. And then how does on something that's online really stand out against previous technologies that probably had a lot of the same questions that online sort of.
Absolutely, and not just in relationships, but how we communicate and everything else, definitely. And I guess what I would say to that is, firstly, we can't just look at online versus face-to-face or telephone or even telegraph. And there are similarities across each of those in itself. But even when you look at the internet, an online dating site is going to be quite different to meeting someone in a discussion group or in a chat room, or even through via a social networking site, which lots of people are going to do as well. So what's important to do is to look at each of the different qualities of that communication and how it actually works. So you might look at, is there, for instance, in chat rooms or discussion groups, a chance for more dialogue before you actually present everything about yourself. So that makes things different. Whether it's happening in more real time, or whether there's time to be strategic and take your time to respond to them in email, that's going to be different as well. And this cuts across not just with looking at relationships, but all sorts of things like the stuff we're doing on deception at the moment. Each space and each of its qualities are different. But the rules of the space is also important. So when you're looking at online dating, each online dating site has its own agenda and its own rules and the own ways that people learn how to behave. When I was doing interviews with online daters, one of the things they talked about is this sense of community and how they learnt certain ways to behave because others had kind of communicated that to them, and they learnt this through dates, and they learnt how to do online dating just from the experience of just doing it and sharing the rules, I guess, or creating the rules as well. And I know that's a short answer, but I think it's really more complicated than just going online versus offline.
Yes.
Yeah, I was quite interested to hear what you said about the effort that people go to create their own profile online, and trying to think about analogues in the offline, or perhaps maybe creating a CV, or perhaps looking at oneself in the mirror before going out in an evening.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that there's something really quite different about creating, refining, arguably perfecting
Yep.
this image of the self over
Yes.
a long period, a very reflective process.
Absolutely.
And maybe unique. But so in your interviews, did you find that people had started to think about themselves in a different way?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's, and in some ways that was a nice experience for them to be able to reflect on themselves and go, oh my goodness, that's how other people see me. In other ways, it was actually quite a difficult experience for some people, and actually their self-esteem, they said, sometimes plummeted, going, I was attracting these people, what is it about me that attracted, and so because of this overestimation, people that were 10 years older would contact people so much younger and whatever, and all that kind of stuff, but also really having a deep reflection about themselves. So you're quite right, psychologically it was very interesting about not just presenting, but thinking about who they are, engaging with that process, that people are judging them, and when they judge them on these sites, they can be very harsh judges of them as well. And so some people were saying, that's it, I can't do this anymore because my self-esteem can't cope with this kind of judgment of myself, and I want to be happy with myself and not think too much about it as well. But others were saying it was actually a pleasant experience to be able to engage and really think about who they are, and it made them think, well, who do I really want to be with as well? That was kind of a helpful process for them. Who do I want my partner to be like, rather than, oh, that person over there that'll do me for the next partner or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, I can see that my first thought about a profile was that it's a very instrumental thing. That the function of this profile is to attract somebody that I would find attractive.
Yep.
It is beyond that.
Absolutely,
It seems
absolutely
it's
beyond that.
It's
Yeah.
requiring people to think about themselves in a deep way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that means that we have to be careful with psychological, safeguards here as well, because it can upset people too much, and they haven't got anyone counselling them, telling them, are you okay with this? And because of the stigmatisation involved, not everyone self-discloses to others, their friends, that they're actually doing this. And some people, because of my research, will tell me, maybe a year or so later after they engaged in using online dating, that, oh God, I had to go with that, and this is what was my experience, and I had to stop because I couldn't keep going with this by myself, with this reflection of this mirror, and it is a mirror, and there's no one else around to gauge how true these people's perspectives are, I guess. Yeah.
I know we got more questions, but I think a lot of these could be thrown at all the speakers in a minute. But I'm not going to let you off the lectern and tell us about the future of online dating.
Oh, the future of online. Okay, yes. Well, the future of online dating, when I looked at all these solutions, were ways to develop online dating. So I think, I might be wrong, but I think online dating is probably here to stay. But it does have to be refined, and it does have to be looking at these kind of things in terms of issues of design. How do we find ways in the design to weed out kind of issues of trust? One thing that I know True.com in the States are doing is things like checks on criminal checks on whether they're married or not, because some people, as we found, married people use online, not saying you personally, but you're glad you asked me a question now. And ways to develop this work, working the work of presenting a profile. How do you help people do that? But how do you help them in terms of making more effective kind of choices? And that can happen with the design as well, thinking about looking at social psychology, looking at social identity theory, and looking at what are some of those kind of categories that are important when people actually develop friendships and when they develop romantic relationships as well, rather than matching on, that photo looks good, or I want that age and I want that location or whatever as well. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I hadn't noticed until this presentation how much more complicated it is than the dyadic relationship, because now the online dating service, it's a three-way trust relationship.
Absolutely,
in a sense, and
yeah.
quite complicated. But anyway, thank you very much, and then we'll go to Professor Walker.